Coogs House. The college basketball world was flipped upside down overnight ahead of the national championship game on Monday. But what's the trickle-down effect to Houston?
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Cougs, the daily podcast about your Houston Cougars. And I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach, Parker Ainsworth, here to break down all things Cougs. And whether you're a Houston fan or just a hater who came to step by, thank you for making Locked On Cougs your first listen at this point. It's mid-morning, so maybe not your first necessarily, but listen of the day. If you want to join the conversation but don't know what to say, tell us in the comments down below what the first sporting event you ever attended was. More on that later. Today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn. More on that later as well. We got a lot of things to get into today. Spring football game is this upcoming weekend. I do want to save some time at the end to talk about questions going into that. That will take up the bulk of our week here at Locked On Cougs. I do want to spend some time talking about Jamal Shead and kind of the ultimate achievement he had there at the end of the season with the award show over the weekend. But first and foremost, the story of college basketball right now, and it does pertain to Houston, is Calipari taking the Arkansas job. So I want to talk through the coaching carousel and how this trickles into Cougarland very, very soon. But it all starts up I-45 actually at SMU, where SMU fired Rob Lanier, who had only made them better. They fired Tim Jankovic a couple years ago at 24 wins. Lanier came in, had a 10-win program, turned them into a 20-win program by year two. But they fired him because they think they're an ACC team, even though they're not making any money from the ACC. And for what it's worth, Lanier had brought like high-end recruits that had gone elsewhere and not been successful to transfer back to the DFW. He was a fairly well-respected coach across the state of Texas, especially amongst high school coaches. SMU decided no, got rid of him, then went and hired Andy Enfield. Now, Andy Enfield was at USC. He was at Florida Gulf Coast for that, a March Madness run before that. In the Pac-12, they never broke 26 wins. He had the second lowest win total in his USC tenure, actually, this past season at 15. Kind of crazy how unsuccessful Andy Enfield had been at USC, given his success at Florida Gulf Coast, as well as all the recruiting tools in your backyard at USC, including NIL money. Could have fed off this Bronny James, Juju Watkins NIL stuff last year as well. Didn't do any of that. They had Okongwu, Evan Mobley, DeAnthony Melton, a bunch of pros come through, and Andy Enfield couldn't do anything with any of that either. Really disappointing tenure, I would say, for Andy Enfield at USC, but SMU decided he was the guy to go get. And obviously, maybe I'm part of Rob Lanier, but that's the trade-off they decided to do there at USC for whatever reason they may be. Now that leaves the opening at USC. They take their NIL money and go get Eric Musselman from Arkansas. Now, unlike Andy Enfield, Musselman has grown that program over the last 5 years. They had a not so great 2023-24 season, and I get that argument. But understandably, they'd had a really good couple years before that. They were pulling in high-end guys, taking advantage of all of the NIL money Arkansas has to offer. And one thing that's come to light at the national level in this discussion is that Arkansas has a lot of NIL money. So much so that after their job gets vacated, they go get Coach Calipari from Kentucky. Now, Calipari had almost been fired at Kentucky. Apparently, he's friends with the guy that owns Tyson Food, that billionaire. Tyson Food guy is an Arkansas guy. And between Tyson's money, Jerry Jones's money, Walmart money, Murphy Oil, J.B. Hunt, all of that money, they pull Calipari from Kentucky to Arkansas. Clear all-in move, trying to revitalize a program from the 80s and 90s, the 40 minutes a heck kind of stuff. And I want to stress, they're paying him $9 million a year, right? Crazy high amount for a college basketball coach. And again, NIL money through the roof. Kentucky is an open job. Kentucky is a blue blood job. You're going to hear people mention Kelvin Sampson's name for it. I'm telling you, it's not happening. Now, I think it's not happening for a number of reasons. For one, he clearly has built this thing up in Houston, and all he ever talks about is how the reason he went back to college was to build something. There's no building at Kentucky. That is the blue blood They could lose 20 games next season and make the tournament on branding alone, right? That's not a build it up kind of thing. That's not why he came back to college basketball per himself. It's also, frankly, not a move you make at this point in your life. He's an older guy. He's made it very clear this is the last stop. He said that a couple different times. He's passing it on to Kellen at some point. Very, very obvious that he is not leaving for that gig. He's not made any indication. Frankly, for what it's worth, I see Kentucky going after more like, can they pull Dan Hurley out of UConn? Can they get Billy Donovan from the Bulls? Can they get Jay Wright out of retirement? Can they get one of those blue blood kind of guys that's been around the block for a second? Or they look at like a younger guy, like a Nate Oates out of Alabama, Scott Drew out of Baylor. Jerome Tang has been tossed around a bunch of these jobs. Love Jerome Tang is at Kansas State. Or even Otzenberger at Iowa State, who's had a great couple years there, right? Like, I see those as the kinds of moves they're making, not an older guy like Kelvin. And frankly, I don't see Kellen leaving. And I don't think they're going to offer an assistant coach for the Kentucky job either, for a number of different reasons. The bigger way this impacts Houston, though, is what it does for Arkansas. Hear me out on this. Arkansas is not just a program that had Tremont Mark transfer there from Houston last year. Arkansas is a big-time player in Texas high school basketball recruiting. They get top-end kids from this state all the time. This is a key marker for what that program is doing as far as investing in basketball. And when I say, again, and I'm talking NIL money investing in basketball, you can legally pay these guys to come play for you. It's not quite called pay for play directly, but all kinds of ways that can happen, right? I'm talking Jerry Jones money, Walmart money, Murphy Oil money, JB Hunt money, Tyson Foods, those chicken fingers I ate way too much of in the last 10 years. Those kinds of money, that kind of money is all tied to what's happening here. And what's fascinating is that, you could make the argument that kind of hurt their roster last year. But the year before that, they had 3 dudes go pro: Anthony Black, Jordan Walsh, etc. Right? Like, that's a strong program in terms of the last few years of success. They got the money into it, put a coach into it that's great at getting one and done kids. And I think that hurts Houston more than anything that's happening at Kentucky, because all those one and done kids in the state of Texas, I know Jalen Shelley decommitted. I know Liam McNeely hasn't mentioned Arkansas. Those high-end 5-star recruits that are seniors in high school right now, those 2 kids in particular being uncommitted, or the 2025s that are uncommitted, etc. Those kids that think they're one and dones can now see the NIL dollars and the playing for Coach Cal at the same time in nearby Arkansas. Arkansas has always recruited Texas hard and well, and I think that's the more immediate impact to Houston. Now, admittedly, the kids Cal likes and the kids that Sampson likes are very different kids typically. They're usually not going after the same kind of guy. Frankly, I would argue that's why Houston's been to 5 straight Sweet 16s and Cal bluntly hasn't, right? But I do think that you're going to see an increased competition amongst the state of Texas in that instance, in a way that you didn't really see it when Musselman was there, in a way you don't really see it out of, UT Austin, in a way you don't really see it necessarily out of Tech looking for a different kind of kid, right? I think that all these different programs kind of have their different niches. Arkansas with Cal strikes me as the kind of school that's now going to be coming through Texas looking for that top caliber kid. And regardless of what happens at Kentucky, regardless of who they hire, I think Cal to Arkansas impacts Houston and basketball recruiting in a much stronger way. Now, where does Jalen Shelley end up landing? Where does Liam McNeely end up going? Where are all these kids in the transfer portal going? Tremont Mark from Houston, then Arkansas, is in the transfer portal right now. Like, where do those guys and kids end up going? Now, they're not a conference competitor. I don't think it impacts Houston in terms of their Big 12 standing, unless they were to peel off one of those coaches like Scott Drew, Jerome Tang, whoever, right? Like, if they were to pull those guys over, I guess you could argue that somehow would impact Houston a little bit, because it frankly would soften up the conference some for Houston to come in and kind of make some headway in, right? Continue to make headway in. I guess they won the dang thing regular season last year, right? That's the Big 12 competition thing I could see this trickling into. But the biggest thing is, where do these great high school players from the state of Texas end up playing. There's a bunch of options nearby. That seems to seal the deal for one. Now, I will say it makes me laugh that SMU started this whole thing by firing a coach that had no reason to fire, and they ended up getting the worst coach out of all the guys being circulated around. But that seems fairly par for the course. I want to talk some in a second as we look at the situation further. I want to talk some about a guy that may be and is probably leaving the program to go pro in Jamal Shead in a second. I also want to talk some about Fritz's first spring, as I'm saying that's misspelled there. Yikes. But first, I want to talk some about our buddies over at LinkedIn. LinkedIn Jobs. Having some trouble this morning. LinkedIn Jobs is your number one place for your small business to find quality professionals that are right for your role. And that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs is the tools you need to find the professionals for your team faster and for free. If you can find a defensive player of the year like Jamal Shead for your business, you need to go ahead and do it. LinkedIn is not just on the job board. LinkedIn has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, makes it the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals you can't find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all that while making the process easy and intuitive. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing thin, and people working at small businesses are only wearing a bunch of different hats. You might not have the time or resource to make that hire. That's why you got to go to LinkedIn Jobs. You can constantly find ways to make that process easier. Post job free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right. I said I want to talk something about Jamal Shead, and over the weekend, Jamal Shead had another big end of season awards banquet in which he won the Naismith Defensive Player of the Year for all of men's college basketball and gave a very heartwarming speech about support he's gotten from his family, his parents, and Coach Sampson. He credited the Defensive Player of the Year to being a team award and that he's just the biggest name or best defender on the best defensive team in the country, and that's really what the award comes down to. And frankly, you and I both know Jamal Shead well enough to know that was always going to be his response, always going to be the way he went about this. But I also wanted to stress that, that's incredibly, in the moment to just give all the credit to everyone else is something that you don't typically see at these award shows. I mean, see the I like thank God and my family thing to open the speech, and there's usually some talk about the path or whatever to get there. Jamal Shead spoke entirely on other people, right? And I think that's what we understand and know about Jamal Shead. But what I really want to harp on some too, though, is that guys Jamal's size, as tremendous as Jamal is, don't typically win Defensive Player of the Year awards. They just don't, right? The Naismith Award's been around for a little less than a decade. The NABC Award has been around for closer to 3. And you can count the guys under 6'2" that have won the Defensive Player of the Year awards on a hand, right? In terms of the Naismith Award, it's Jamal Shead, Davion Mitchell, and Javon Carter. That's it. That's the entire list of guys that won the Naismith Defensive Player of the Year award under 6'2". The other two guys are both in the NBA, right? That's the kind of specific level defender we're talking about. In terms of the NABC award, has been around a little bit longer. It's Jamal Shead, Davion Mitchell. Javon Carter won it twice, for what it's worth. Aaron Craft was 6'2", so that's my under 6'2" thing. It's a little flirting with the line a little bit. John Linehan, he had 4.5 steals per game, 2002 for Providence. He won the award. Steve Wojciechowski, 1998, was at Duke, and Tommy Amaker in the 80s was at Duke as well. That's the whole list there. So if you don't count Kraft, you're back down to 5 people, and that's, again, a handful of people that have ever won NABC's Defensive Player of the Year award under 6'2". You see long wings, you see big centers and forwards more traditionally win those awards. You don't typically see guards, point guards, win Defensive Player of the Year awards. Now, schematically, I don't mean to belabor this a lot, but there are a couple ways that's reasons that's normally the case, I should say. For one, you can typically get screens and stuff like that to get a guard off of your guard. So theoretically, it'd be easy to do. Jamal Shead, Davion Mitchell, Javon Carter, all are incredibly talented at navigating screens and thus don't get switched off a whole lot. They don't get forced into switches very often. Okay. 2, typically a team's best offensive player is more like, even if they bring the ball up, is more like a wing-sized guy, or in college basketball, you can see a lot of bigs, right? And so it's hard to be the best defensive player on the floor if you're not stopping the best opponent's offensive player. This is in part because Jamal Shead marks up with guys 6'4", 6'5" regularly. He doesn't really matter to him how much shorter he is than the other team's best player. He's going to impact the game defensively in a way that demonstrates that he's the best player on the floor, right? The other thing is, and third and final point, and reason why you don't see many guys under 6'2" win these awards, and why it's so impressive Jamal Shead wins these awards, are the easiest types of defenses to put out there funnel all the traffic to your 7-footer at the rim to get blocked shots. You see Purdue do it with Zach Edey, or UConn do it with Klingon. All these different programs that have big traditional 7-footers funnel down to the big guy. He gets a block. Someone gets a rebound, the takeoff, run it, boom, right? Houston, while they have, I would argue, pretty good shot blockers back there in Jamal Shead's time, whether it was Jarris and Jawan last year, or this Jawan and Javier. I mean, like, they've had Josh Carlton. They've had guys back there that can block shots. That's not been the problem. The deal is that Jamal Shead doesn't need to funnel to anybody, right? Like, he does not need to do that. So he is out at the perimeter, stealing the ball, poking the ball, deflecting the ball, forcing turnovers, getting blocks. I mean, one of the most iconic plays of the season was in Toyota. So now when Houston played A&M the first time at Toyota, and he had the big block on Wade Taylor's jump shot to kind of get a shot clock violation. Like that, like those kinds of plays we grew accustomed to watching Jamal Shead make in his time at Houston are far from the norm. They just are, right? And interestingly enough, I was trying to look at the offensive stats from guys that were under 6'2" and won this award, because I think the argument I would make is that you actually probably had the awards flip-flop. Jamal Shead probably should have been considered the player of the year because he did it on the offensive end as well, with Zach Edey or a big Klingon, whoever, being the defensive player of the year, right? That's a more natural setup, right? Point guard, orchestrating and keeping the pace and doing all the things offensively. Compared to the other 6'2" and under guys, Jamal Shead's more comparable to Jevon Carter, maybe even Davion, although in conference Shead had a much better season than Davion Mitchell's 2021 Baylor season. His numbers stack up much greater, though, than the other guys on this list, right? The Crafts, the Lenahans, the Wojciechowskis, Amaker. Jamal Shead's offensive game, both statistically and qualitatively, is leaps and bounds above those guys. He had a much stronger impact on game in terms of points, assists, control of pace, at points per 100 possessions, assists per 100 possessions than anyone else, but especially those guys from the farther back down the list. Jevon Carter, Davion Mitchell, both had pretty similar raw stats, but then you look at the 100 possessions and you got to remember how slow a pace Houston played at times of the season. You're like, oh my gosh, Jamal Shead's getting 15 points, but they only played 65 possessions, right? Like, those kinds of things become that much more magnified when you look at comparing Jamal Shead to those guys. Jamal Shead truly is a once-in-a-lifetime kind of guy. And I don't mean just on the floor. I mean the same kind of guy that wears the pink suit, but also gives credit to his teammates, but also does the Skims commercials, but also gets down and dirty on defense. But all of those different things combine to make one unique face of the program in Jamal Shead. And we talked about in the middle of the season that he's probably the guy, if not him or Marcus, to get their jerseys retired, maybe both, in the rafters next to wherever they inevitably put Kelvin Sampson's name, next to Akeem, next to Clyde, next to all those guys, right? I cannot think of, after watching him help this team and program into the Big 12, I cannot think of a better representative for this program. I just can't. I'm open to hearing names. I'm open to hearing suggestions. Maybe it's Mercy Miller and he proves me out, right? I mean, maybe it's a future guy we haven't seen. Jamal Shead has not made his official pro declaration yet. It feels inevitable. It feels, frankly, warranted. He's a pro. He looks like it. But man, it eats you up a little bit to know that, like, you got robbed of seeing what that final run could have actually looked like. And that's hard to swallow because he is the embodiment of all the positives of this program. Now I want to talk some and switch gears to football right fast. I want to talk some about what spring football is going to look like. But first, I should probably elaborate some on what led to this having to be a mid-morning episode. So, if you follow me on sports media or whatever, social media, I did go to the Rockets and Mavs game last night. We had to drive to a train station, take the train down, and all that kind of stuff. We took little man to his first ever pro sports. Why the question today was, what was your first game you attended? We got home late last night. Little man had a great day. Awesome game. Rockets lost, but it happened. He was great, etc. We get home, and in the middle of the night, I'm writing an episode, trying to figure out what I'm going to do. I'm recording, everyone's asleep, and he just starts puking. He's okay now. We're going to the doctor in a second, but he's been okay all night and morning. Man, I got to stay home from work today. He's upstairs napping. We're all good. But him puking is what led to me ultimately having to delay when this episode is. So if I'm a little erratic, it's because it was a night light on sleep, lighter than normal, to make sure that he was all right. But we're here talking about it. And this week, before the Calipari news broke and all that was going to kind of shift up the episode, I wanted to spend in the episode I was writing last night and kind of shifting the writing of last night before all that happened, getting ready for the spring game this Saturday. We got an actual spring football game being played this Saturday, Houston versus Houston, and a game that technically Houston cannot lose, right? And I guess at this point, I've got a lot of questions I want to spend the week investigating. And the first question has to start with, who's taking snaps? We know Donovan Smith is coming off of being a starter all last season, had some surgery on his labrum, and has not been able to throw over the course of spring practice, right? He's been clearly active in a bunch of other drills, a bunch of other ways, doing footwork, doing scout stuff on air, trying to help, you can tell he's actively involved in learning the offense and those kinds of things. But he can't throw this spring. He's got the labrum surgery. So you look at the backup, Zion Chris. Zion Chris transferred in from Louisiana. I always want to say Louisiana Lafayette, but technically it's called Louisiana now. His 2 seasons there, he appeared in 12 games. He has an injury redshirt from one of those 2 years. He was 111, 168 for 12 touchdowns and 1,300 yards. Pretty impressive considering how young he was. That's 66%, 110 yards per game if you're doing math at home. He also added in 6 rushing touchdowns. All of those came in last season. A much bigger season for him in 2023, that is. Comparatively, Donovan Smith had his own 6 rushing touchdowns last season, 4,300 yards. He had a receiving touchdown people kind of sometimes will forget about for 28 yards. 22 touchdowns and 64.5% completion. Again, he played against Big 12 competition. That's, I think, the competition for starter of the fall of program in the fall is, what does young Chris gain this spring, and can he catch up? I think it's Donovan's job to lose. I don't think Donovan's actually in that big competition. I do think you'll see if Zion puts on a show, does he become a packagey, wildcatty kind of guy? He's got electric speed, folks. He can boogie. I don't know how they'll monitor that in the spring game, if they'll let him get out and run around some, or what the deal there will be. I do know that in the fall, he's live, and that's when you want to let him go out and run, right? And so we'll see what that looks like. I imagine you see some sort of an impact package with young Chris out there. The other thing I'll say, and this is maybe insight I'm hearing from people I'm talking to there, obviously as someone who lives far away, I'm not there every day, but talking to folks, it sounds like the backup for the spring game, or the second team quarterback for the spring game, because Zion Chris will be playing with the first team because Donovan Smith will not be there, is actually Caleb McMichael. It will not be Wheeler. It might not be Lucas Coley. It's looking like Caleb McMichael, redshirt freshman out of Bronzeville, Georgia. And I got to say, folks, I just want to see him play. I don't know a whole lot about this kid. It sounds like he's having a great spring, though, to be leapfrogging people on the depth chart. And frankly, what does he bring to the table that maybe Zion and maybe Donovan don't, right? What can he bring to the competition? Competition brings the best out of all the guys. So we'll see there. I also want to see what the best versions of this offensive line are. You lost you lost 4 of your 5 starters, so to say, because Tank is coming back. But you lost 4 of your 5 starters on the offensive line from last season. Patrick Paul, pros. Jack Freeman has been trying out with teams for the pros as well. He may be a pro by this fall yet. We'll see. Best of luck to him. You're seeing all kinds of names been thrown out there. I think the only solid starter you've got on the books right now, Tank, and then Pancake Hunter at center. Pancake started a game last year when Jack went out with a concussion. You also, frankly, know that Pancake was your highest ranked recruit of any of your offensive linemen. Kid's a stud. And so now that he's kind of grown up physically into the position, I imagine you'll see him as a starter as well. So I guess you got 2 out of the 5 that you know. What about those other 3? We haven't mentioned a tackle yet. Is it going to be Nduke and Cedric Melton? Is it going to be Habdi Lee? What happens to those tackle spots? Who looks like they can hold up against the Big 12 pass rush, right? Other guard spots, going to be Peyton Dunn, Caden Bowie. Like, what's going to happen in those spots as well? On the defense side of the ball, in the trenches, I think it's also important to look at, like, culturally, Houston's become a program where they have a great D-line each and every year. But this year, it's going to be a lot of names we don't know. and it looks like a little bit smaller group. How much run does Justin Benton get? Justin Benton was a highly touted recruit that came in last season. I believe got officially qualified for a red shirt on the season last year. Where's he fit into the mix right now, right? I mean, you got to think he gets on the field some. Anthony Holmes lost a lot in the transfer portal and the graduation on the defensive line. Agwegbu and Nelson Caesar both going pro. Hurts. Dot Nwankwo going to Colorado. Hurts. What are you going to do to replace those guys? We hadn't even mentioned the coaching change there. And obviously, I think that they'll be fine, but there was a cultural shift in that as well. So what did the defensive line look? Speaking of coaching, the other couple questions I have on coaching, and we'll look at this, of course, the week is, what is the offense going to look like? Like, what is Kevin Barbay going to do? He's run a bunch of different offenses across his time, different places. I don't imagine he brings in the exact same stuff he did at Mississippi State, but could also see him bringing in stuff he did before at places like Stephen F. I don't know what to make of the offense he's going to bring out there. Defensively, what is Fritz's focus going to be? Fritz is a defensive-minded guy. I think the undersold thing about those Tulane teams is going to be that they had a fairly strong defense for the American Athletic Conference, even though we think of Tajay Spears in the run game. That run game and the defense work together a lot. So what will Fritz's defense look like in Houston, right? We hadn't thought of Houston as a defensive powerhouse in quite a while, frankly. We've always thought about the glitz, the glam, the offensive skill guys, the skinny guys. It might be a different era under Fritz. It will be a different era under Fritz, but it might be a visibly different era under Fritz. And what will that look like if you've got corners and safeties and those kind of guys becoming your like marquee names and playmakers? What will that look like for Houston? Now, all of that is to say that we hopefully have an exciting week of previewing football ahead of us. Obviously, when things like Calipari mixing up the whole college basketball world come in, we got to talk some about the basketball program as well. But big time spring game coming up this weekend means we have a lot to cover there. So we'll be checking in on each and every day here at Locked On Cougs. Hopefully, Little Man's not throwing up anymore. I'll be here each and every morning, first thing in the morning for you. Locked On Cougs is a proud member of the Locked On Podcast Network. That means your team, our Houston Cougars, each and every day. Go Cougs.